All right. John Buchholz, I think it's in you already.
What I have to say is more of a comment than a question, but I could also rephrase it as a question. But I will.
Whichever you think you can express most eloquently.
It will be the comment then. Stand? I'm loud, I'm loud.
All right.
For too long, we have defined orthodoxy as the opposite of heresy. And therefore, we have created an enemy other to feel right about ourselves. But I want to point out that the opposite of orthodoxy is not heresy, but heterodoxy. And heterodoxy is just a different way of doing things. And if I may give a real-life example, if you watch David knitting, now, it is something that I, as a man, usually do not do. And when I see David knitting, I feel uncomfortable. And liberation theology, I think, calls us to feel uncomfortable, to do things that we usually do not do, and to see such things as heterodoxy and not heresy. And heterodoxy can very much be about orthodoxy.
Very good, thank you. Do you have any questions for Ed, perhaps? Anyone else who hasn't asked a question yet? Yes.
For Western theology, how would you describe the particularities and the biases in Western theology? Do you find them to be there or not?
Biases in what? Sorry, particularities? Is that what you said?
Yeah, in Western theology. Are there any blind spots in those theologies?
Well, the right answer is yes. And that's probably the most correct answer, and I think the answer that I would definitely give. But you know, it's really hard to dive into this thing, and which is why sort of I agree with Mr. Buchholz in sort of this using liberation theology as, and I know, and John had just mentioned this sort of using it as a way to reflect back to Western theology, to point out the discrepancies, the biases, the particularities that are negative and need to be corrected, and also those that are good and can be uplifted. But see, that's the thing. It's sort of a reflection. It's a mirror and less a lens. They shouldn't be seen sort of one over the other, sort of into the other. They can be seen side by side, which is what a course on liberation theology and systematic theology, or liberation theology and Western theology could be about, or a course, or maybe even just a section in systematic theology. And so I'm not saying that these discrepancies aren't, or sorry, these biases aren't there. And if I were to say that, I would be a liar and a cheat. And so, because those are there, they need to be seen, and liberation theology can be a way to do that, but it should not be the primary way, and it should not sort of, they should be sort of side by side type thing.
Okay, thank you. Who else? In the back.
To Noah. Question is, in my opinion, so Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson did great harm to American Christianity from the right. Does liberation theology run the same risk of harming American Christianity from the left?
Well, yes. Because liberation theology can be seen to support socialism, and in socialism, has a bad name in America. I do want to quote something, though. So Dom Helder Camara, so it's a Latin American theologian, he says, as the Populorum Progressio points out, even liberal capitalism has materialistic roots, is directly responsible for the rise of an international dictatorship of economic power. Why not recognize that there is no longer just one type of socialism, and put a plea in for Christians to break free from adverse connotations of the term? So, Pope John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger, they blamed liberation theology and liberation theologians for combining the gospel with secular politics. They accused liberation theology that it had a Marxist character. Pope John Paul said that God and God's reign is different than our government here on earth. And yes, I agree. I believe that God will bring a new political order to earth. But to say what's wrong with socialism is to say that there's not one kind of socialism, that you can have different kinds of socialism. So that's why we need to start the discussion. Marxism, was that the proper kind of socialism? Or can we invent a different kind of socialism to know how we can help people? So yes, liberation theology can be harmful to people coming from the left, but that's why we need to very much analyze, criticize, and to see what the truth is in liberation theology and to understand what liberation theologians are really thinking.
Thank you. See, hand in the back. I can't see who that is, though. Whoever's... Yes.
One, how are we defining American Christianity, especially in the context of liberation theology, when there are definitely theologians here in the United States that are liberation theologians? And then also, how are we defining harmful? Because harmful is a very powerful word. So if we can, if either one of you can address that.
Okay. Would you like to address that first?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Well, I would say in this context, since American Christianity being thus sort of its own ecumenical little c Catholic type ideology, it does include liberation theologies and others. For the sake of at least my argument, if I were to state American Christianity, I would sort of be talking about this Western theology developed from Augustine and popes and et cetera, all that stuff we learned in church history. And so I guess that would be my answer about Christianity, American Christianity defined. Harmful, for me, and on my side, I mean, this could be different, it probably will be for Mr. Buchholz, but for me, harmful, I would suggest, is it creates the possibility of sort of an unbalanced situation, and this can be true of other theologies, even theologies from the far right, which is why I would also speak against them. And so what we have to do, sort of as Christians today, is to find this balance between the far left and far right, however you want to define those sort of theologies, and sort of apply that to life, to church, etc. And maybe systematic theology can be a way to do that, bringing it all back to the topic. So, thank you.
Okay. Noah, do you have anything you'd like to say to that, or do you need to hear the question repeated?
Nothing I need to say.
Okay, very good. Yes, in purple jacket there.
Hi, my name is Tara, and this is directed at Noah. My fear when we talk about a primary lens of liberation theology is that it will become the dominant, whereas Western theology has been the dominant. And if all of it is supposed to be a critical across the board, if it's the primary lens we're looking through, what is criticizing liberation theology and what might be missing there? I feel like it's going to be a switch where, you know, people wanted Jesus to become the oppressor of their oppressors. And it doesn't seem like it creates a critical across the board, critical thinking across the board.
I think that's a great question. Okay, so yes, I do think that we need to teach theology primarily through the lens of liberation theology. And I think that perhaps Western theology, it will be decreased if we do that, but I think we need to remember that our culture is already heavily influenced by Western theology. And as I said earlier, in the library we see the bookshelves full of Western theologians So exposure to liberation theology doesn't have enough room. And so I think that we don't realize that we naturally tend to focus on our own culture and that we don't open our eyes to other cultures. So if we use liberation theology as a lens, it will expand our horizons, it will challenge us to think about others. Contextualized theology is a foundational part of liberation theology, and it's much needed because it teaches us how to think unselfishly. It teaches us to seek communication and how to communicate theology and doctrines in different ways through different concepts. So Western theology, we are already so rooted in it. We have language already. Liberation theology will help us to become halfway, slightly unrooted from our Western theology.
Ed, do you have any response to that?
Not to her question.
Okay. Well, what about what you just said?
Okay, so just going on what Noah said, I find it interesting then that I don't know if he's doing this on purpose or maybe just didn't expound upon it, but I see sort of liberation theology within the history of Western theology. I had mentioned sort of these ascetic monks, so like Anthony and the church fathers, and we have liberation theology to an extent does exist in Western theology, and I don't know if how he wants to react if he can or something, but that was just sort of my comment to.
Okay. Well, now how do you respond to Ed's point that we already have elements of liberation theology within Western theology as it has been handed down to us?
Liberation theology grew out of Western theology. I would agree with that because liberation theology, or Western theology, has been dominant for so long. But that doesn't mean that liberation theology is the same as Western theology. So when he speaks about the ascetic monks, their activities, their teachings, is actually the opposite of liberation theology. The ascetic monks sought to detach from the physical world and to attach to the spiritual world. So they had a dichotomy between the body and the spirit. But liberation theology speaks directly against that. What liberation theology says is that spirit and the body have to be combined and they have to be tightly knit and united. So when God made humanity, He was not finished. God breathed God's Spirit into humanity, and through that, God created humans to be both body and spirit, and He saw it was good. So a spirit without a body is not humanity. A body without spirit is not humanity. So I think that means that when we discuss theology, we can't only look at the spiritual realm, but we have to look at it also through the bodily realm. And not just through the bodily realm, but also the spirit, combining the two. And so I think that's what liberation theology helps us to do. And asceticism is something completely different. It supports that dichotomy of the spirit and the body.
Okay. So many hands just went up. Over by the window.
Okay. This question is for Noah. We've heard a lot of discussion about liberation theology in terms of a lot of things. But one thing that I haven't heard being discussed is the matter of truth. We haven't talked about the truth of liberation theology or the truth of orthodoxy. I think we've heard some about orthodoxy not necessarily being true. So I would want to ask Noah I guess it's more of a commentary, I suppose, than a question. I can append a question at the end. I'm a bit nervous about the tone of the discussion because we haven't been discussing it in terms of truth. We've been discussing it in terms of what works, and I don't think that Christianity should be discussed in terms of what works. I would hope that we were all Christians because we believe it to be true, not because it helps us. I mean, obviously if it's true, it helps us, but that's because we're oriented towards truth. And so I would think that we would want to focus on orthodoxy because it's true, and if it's true, then it would necessarily be helpful. And I'm just a little bit nervous because I don't, we've talked a lot about Western theology, and to assume that Western theology is flawed because it's Western is to assume that God has not been directing the church for these thousands of years, and that only now are we learning what God really wants.
Okay, thank you.